Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for being here this evening. So today we have an event on nuclear war, nuclear weapons. So in this public event, we will consider the historical and present day risks of nuclear weapons from a humanitarian perspective. By the way, this is organized by the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. I'm Saba Boufked. I always forget to introduce myself. So today you're going to hear from two quite high-level speakers. We're really happy to welcome Dr. Becky Alexis-Martin, who will discuss her award-winning book, Disarming Doomsday. This book critically assesses the global social, cultural, and spatial inequalities and harms perpetrated by nuclear warfare, covering the victims of nuclear tests and the hibakusha in Japan and international movements for disarmament. And then we'll follow nicely with Dr. Frank Boulton, who actually has been quite an activist on this field, who will introduce the technical aspects of nuclear weapons and its impact, the risks of nuclear use in the present with a focus on Ukraine, and recommendations for harm prevention. So I'm going to first welcome Dr. Becky Alexis-Martin. So she is a multidisciplinary academic in applied social sciences and humanities. Her research practice coalesces around a nexus of science, technology, and health, but also social justice and human rights and post-colonial and decolonial discourses. She's the author of 33 peer-reviewed academic papers and book chapters, and an award-winning pacifist scholar, author, and photographer. So her first book that I just mentioned looks at the human impact of nuclear weapons since Hiroshima, published in 2019, won the 2020 LHM Ling Outstanding First Book Prize. Her research projects have included nuclear families, a social study of nuclear test veterans and their families, and atomic atolls, 2018 to present. And finally, her PhD RADPOP that was published in 2017 presented a new model of radiation protection that can be used for emergency planning. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Becky, for being with us.
Thank you, Sab. Hello. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here today and to be talking to you about my book. So my book's called Disarming Doomsday. And I am kind of, I guess, as Saba said, I'm multidisciplinary. I'm a medical anthropologist and human geographer, I guess, a fellow of the World Geographical Society. I organised the first RGS nuclear geography session. My PhD was at Southampton, 33 papers, lots of funding. I'm also one of the Shaw Trust's 100 most influential people with disabilities in the UK as of last year. I do consultancy about nuclear issues to like basic ICANN and the UN. Expert news journalism for Times, got a piece out today, actually, Indie, Guardian and BBC. I'm a research director for the Centre de Research de Information pour le Disarmament et la Sécurité, bonjour pour le francophones, and one of the directors for a campaign for nuclear disarmament, along with many others, because there's a big team of us. And I received life-saving surgeries for a 1 in a million hereditary heart condition over the last 2 years. So basically I had my heart rebuilt, vanished from academia, and now I am back. So hello. My book that I'm talking to you about today is Disarming Doomsday. So and it explores the kind of human impacts of nuclear war. So why write a book? It's a monstrous endeavor. You know, you sit there and you spend hours slaving over a hot laptop, wishing you'd never started it. But it's actually quite worthwhile. And my motivations for writing Disarming Doomsday were that there was no literature that brought together the spatialities beyond geopolitics and IR. There was little about these kind of mappings and unmappings, inequalities, colonialism, oppression, all these kind of humanitarian issues were ignored. There was nothing that brought together feminist, indigenous and pacifist understandings. Little on culture, community and kinship that linked to space, not enough STS. And I felt as though zones of peace and conflict were not kind of appropriately delineated in a way that somebody who wants to learn about nuclear weapons without being condescended to or baffled could understand. So Disarming Doomsday kind of fulfills that sweet spot, I guess, for people who are studying or researching and want to have a really comprehensive understanding of humanitarian issues to do with nuclear warfare and their geographies, because I am a human geographer after all, so I'm always going to love a map. And so it consists of 9 chapters. You've got a kind of introduction to like radical geographies, thinking through these post-colonial issues, right? Thinking through feminism, thinking through disability studies, thinking through the law. Then a secret history, so this insight into the history of the dark places where nuclear weapons were made and what they're like nowadays as well, with the veil removed. The mystery of the X-ray hands is all about my research from 2015 on the nuclear test veteran community in the UK. I did 144 interviews, so it's got some of that in there. Some work on after nuclear imperialism, so looking at the other study sites and kind of how communities have been affected. After nuclear war, so survivors, survivalists, preppers, all these kind of communities out there, and kind of how they think about what will happen if we have a nuclear attack, but also the consequences. So more severely, things like mutually assured destruction, nuclear winter, things that Frank is going to talk about later with eloquence and beauty, I am sure. And strange cartographies, war games. I don't know if any of you have ever played Fallout. I interviewed Fallout players specifically for this chapter, because I wanted to think about how we think about the nuclear imaginary, right? Okay, it's not enough to just kind of think about the physical and the theoretical. You want to know how people conceive of and understand nuclear war. And one of the best ways to do that is to kind of get deep inside nuclear culture and see how people understand, see how they react, see what they think. And of course, spaces of irregularity, so this issue of chance, luck, stochasticity, whatever you call it, and the challenges around kind of the irregular nature of warfare, but particularly nuclear warfare, and kind of how policies try and constrain in the beast but don't quite work. Spaces of peace and future war zones. So there's a lot to kind of explore. I've chosen 4 chapters to talk you through today. I hope you find them an interesting taster and an interesting insight into the wild world that I lived while I wrote this book and continue to do. So while I did this research, I took in 7 countries, US, France, UK, Japan, Australia, Fiji and Kiribati or Kiribati, in order to collect the data I needed to understand the impacts of nuclear warfare worldwide. And of course, like it's all very well me going, yeah, nuclear war, whatever. But actually, what is the historical context? What is the human context? So as you can see here, I wanted to give you a little bit of kind of nuclear history before we go in deep. So 1895. Roentgen discovers X-rays. Does the nuclear age begin? Nuclear medicine begins a few years later when Marie Curie invents the X-ray machine and takes it out onto the battlefields to ensure that the first X-rays happen in this military setting, which I think is so cool. And so we have these developments, we have this science, and then we get to 1945. And Hiroshima is bombed by the Allies using a bomb called Fat Man, a nuclear weapon, and it's devastating. But how did we get there? The 9th of August, another bomb is dropped. And then afterwards, everybody wants a piece of this power and the Cold War begins. So what I deal with is everything from the 16th of July, 1945, and I'll explain why it's a specific day, into the depths of the future, into kind of notions of what could happen, thinking through different kind of scenarios, different kind of issues, and different kind of geopolitics as well. So that kind of gives you some context. And right now, we're in an interesting predicament. So I don't know if any of you have heard of the Doomsday Clock. Awesome, this helps. So the Doomsday Clock was created to kind of estimate and consider and give like a visual public perspective or insight into the notion of nuclear annihilation, like how close we are to risk, how much danger we might face. And it was it's been published each year by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. They put it out there. And I think the Doomsday Clock's a really interesting mechanism. I actually have some issues with the Doomsday Clock because it used to count down in minutes. But of late, what with climate change and nuclear war, both being part of this, this scenario, it's gone down to seconds, which I feel is cheating, right? They've suddenly got 90 to deal with rather than 2 or 1.5. So I feel like we can kind of stretch out the doomsday clock a little bit more. Now we've kind of changed the nomenclature of how we actually describe it. So I think the doomsday clock is cheeky, but it's a good place to start, because how did we get here? Why are we at 90 seconds at midnight now, right? So my perspective very much is that it all began at the dawn of what I call the atomic Anthropocene, the notion that we, the human age has been affected and created, and we almost have a new time due to nuclear warfare. And the Enola Gay is a kind of integral aspect of this. So one of the things that happened is the Enola Gay, I'm just going to see if I can get this to actually play and do its thing. Aha, brilliant. And the Enola Gay was the aeroplane that dropped the first bomb, Fat Man, to be used in nuclear warfare on Hiroshima on the 6th of August, 1945. This kind of started this new time. Now, it's really interesting, actually, because it caused monstrous devastation. 90% of Hiroshima was destroyed. It was wooden buildings, and obviously you had 120,000 fatalities, right, from Hiroshima. Yet in America, there was so little information about what was going on there. In America, 16th of July, 1945, they did the first kind of nuclear weapons test that was successful in Alamogordo in secrecy. And then when they dropped the bombs, the American public didn't know about the devastation. It was too far, the information didn't reach. And the reason why kind of the first understanding of the horrors of nuclear war emerged, I would argue, is due to a writer, a New Yorker journalist called John Hersey. He wrote an essay called Hiroshima. He went out there and he saw the absolute horror of the atomic blast. The aftermath of the atomic blast. And so he was there like documenting the challenges of humanitarian aid, the successes of humanitarian aid, which I think is really interesting. And it's a book. You can get John Hersey's Hiroshima now as a book, and he wrote a follow-up as well. When we think about these things, if we start from that point of Hiroshima, let's try this. Got it. And this kind of devastation wreaked. What the other thing I want to do is I want to not just be doom and gloom today. I'm not here to tell you the world's going to end. I'm here to give you kind of I guess, an interesting perspective on how recovery arises as well. So I want you to remember this building. This is known as the A-bomb dome in Hiroshima, and it's still standing. But as you can see here, in 1945, that was devastation. But I'm going to talk you through a few different chapters of my book. So while there were these, horrendous consequences from Hiroshima, the people who worked on the bomb actually lived quite interesting and quite nice lives, but they lived in secrecy. So I always think it's really interesting that, oh, sorry, could you? I always think it's really interesting that Los Alamos rose from obscurity, basically. It was nestled in the... No, thank you. It was nestled in the canyons of the New Mexican Mesa, and was to become infamous as the home of the atomic bomb. So the source of the science and technology that propelled and detonated these nuclear weapons. And it was initially only known as Project Y. So it didn't even have a postcode when it was first created, with Secret City. And it wasn't alone. So while it was one of the first secret cities, during the Cold War, they proliferated elsewhere. So Russia also had secret cities. There's an amazing book, actually, about City 40 that's well worth reading if you're interested in this. And each city held secrets. I think it's really interesting because you had like these picket fenced environments that were created to kind of placate and encourage the top-notch scientists to move, in the 1950s. It wasn't like a barracks-like environment at all. It was quite delightful, really. And it provided these stable careers and opportunities for its workers. But there's also this legacy of harm to employees that we don't always think about. So the Los Alamos records show slow, but workers were crushed by rocks, piles of steel, crankshafts, accidentally shot. They died in fatal crashes, horse riding injuries, drownings, barbiturate overdoses, alcohol poisoning, and exploding smoke bombs, of all things. And so you have this kind of dissonance, don't you, between kind of the depiction and the expectation of Los Alamos as this kind of perfect place of science, right? And the actually kind of more chaotic reality. And of course, the apogee of this is the Demon Core, and this small subcritical mass of plutonium that, it was a very dangerous experiment. We were supposed to bombard it with neutrons. And I don't know if anyone's a physicist here, but it's generally not a good idea to do this. And it creates a lot of energy. It creates a lot of opportunity to kind of create almost a critical mass. And it was involved in 2 lethal experiments, not 1, but 2. So there was Harry Daghlian on the 21st of August 1945, and Louis Slotin on the 21st of May 1946. And these experiments were known as tickling the dragon's tail because they were known to be so dangerous. There was actually a 3rd experiment, but they decided to call it off in the end. And so my book writes and considers Los Alamos in a little more depth than I'm able to talk about today. So I think about the women of Los Alamos, the scientists who work there, and kind of what happened to their careers in the aftermath of the Second World War. I also think about kind of what it was like from a more domestic perspective, kind of life there, and explore the lives of some scientists, including Oppenheimer. And I thought I'd mention him because obviously there's a new feature film coming out very soon on my birthday, I might add, if anyone wants to take me out. And purely coincidence. And so I'm quite excited about that. And to see kind of what they found, because I've spent time researching and working in Los Alamos to like develop my work. So it's quite interesting. And so what happened after, Nagasaki and Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we had nuclear weapons testing. So it wasn't enough to just have these little bombs. I say little bombs, they're still pretty big, pretty catastrophic. There was this desire to kind of harness power, harness the ownership of these monstrous nuclear weapons. And the science just kind of, it capitulated, it grew bigger, bolder, stronger, faster, and more dangerous. You can see here, to give you some context, you've got Fat Man, dropped on Nagasaki as 21 kiloton. Then you've got Licorne, 1,000 kiloton by France in 1970. Castle Bravo, 15,000 kiloton in 1954. And then Tsar Bomber, 50,000 kiloton in 1961. Yeah, it's wild. Like these things were so big. This is Tsar Bomber. Tsar Bomber was so big, it like penetrated the atmosphere. This is a photo from above the atmosphere in a plane. It was a monster. Now, what I want to talk about though next is where these bombs were tested, because so often they were described as being like undertaken in these kind of plain, empty, desolate wastelands with no population, no humanity. That's not true. All the places where nuclear weapons were tested had prior human being occupants. They had communities that lived there. So, as I said, my area of expertise is Caricimas and the British nuclear weapon tests, but I've also looked at the Nevada nuclear weapon tests in America, and I've looked at the Algerian nuclear weapon tests in France, and the Chinese nuclear weapon tests in Lot Nor. I've written quite extensively on those in particular. In all of these places, there are indigenous or local people who were affected by these tests from the 1950s to the 1990s. And there's some amazing work out there, not mine, but amazing work out there on these tests, actually. For example, Togsan Casanova has written a book recently called Atomic Step that explores the nuclear weapon tests in Kazakhstan, and it's just outrageously good. Like, if you're going to go away and read something, apart from my book, go read hers. It's amazing. And I love this quote by Arundhati Roy, the idea that nuclear weapons are the ultimate colonizer, whiter than any white man that ever lived, the very heart of whiteness. And so during the Cold War, nations raced to harness the power of these nuclear weapons with catastrophic consequences. And so during my fieldwork, which I include in my book and which I'm still writing up now because I had a couple of years out, there were communities affected internationally. And the people I've worked with were affected by Operation Grapple, so thermonuclear weapon tests, these great big hydrogen bombs. And they're some of the most formidable tests undertaken. And I've gone through the archives. So this is from the AWRE Grapple Operational Report from the AWE archives. This is what they say about these human beings, right? The civilized populations assumed to wear boots and clothing and to wash. The amount of activity to produce this dosage is more than is necessary to give an equivalent dosage to primitive peoples who are assumed not to possess these habits. It is assumed that in the possible regions of fallout and grapple, there may be scantily clad people in boats to whom the criteria of primitive people should apply. So it's clear they were like wildly and horrifically racist, right? Like beyond, they didn't consider the communities that they were testing their nuclear weapons incidentally on to be human. And they didn't care much about their soldiers either, but they did keep their boy soldiers away from the local community in case they kind of thought that maybe, maybe they'd interact and make friends or, actually realize that they were people. So through my interview series, and one of the things that came out was they said, we were told to stay away from their village, especially their women. Some of us gave the children sweets. We bought trinkets. So it's this really transactional relationship that the men who worked on the bomb and the islanders had with each other, these low-ranking boy soldiers. And one of the interesting things that I write about in my book is how I went back to Christmas with 80-year-old nuclear test veterans to memorialize and look at their experiences. How it was really interesting to see how memories of the same place and time were kind of constituted for entanglements of power and colonialism to produce very different realities for these very different groups as they tried to, combine. So there you go, there's a picture of my nuclear test veterans with one of the islanders. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about peace as well. So there's so many different types of nuclear-free zone. They can range from continental size right down to, a city. So Manchester is a nuclear-free zone. And, these, they take many forms. Spaces of peace are created by people as well, not just policy. They're created by human beings. They're created by activism. So while Szilard, Einstein, and Russell, these white male academics, are often the big names in spaces of peace, actually, a lot of the time, what's very interesting in particular for me is the women and nuclear affected communities themselves. So I just wanted to show you a picture of some of the women out there protesting with the CND. So they created spaces of peace, they created spaces of activism, they created the longest lasting peace camp ever, Greenham Common Peace Camp. During the 1980s and 1990s. And activism is still happening now. So this is a photo from the first meeting of the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And you can see here, like, communities have got together, different groups have got together to kind of ban and push back against the bomb. One of the spaces of peace that I find particularly interesting that I've worked on is Hiroshima, as I've mentioned. So I've looked a lot, not just at its past, but how it's been reconstructed and what it's like now. And it's got a really interesting story as a space of peace because its entire design originated from post-nuking a newspaper competition. How astonishing and incredible is that? So this atomic bomb survivor, Sanchi Toje, won the competition after suggesting an international peace memorial garden with a museum and a library. And as you can see, photo here of part of the memorial. Now, does anybody recognize something I might have shown you earlier? It's there, isn't it? The A-bomb dome. So they preserved it as part of the memory within this beautiful, elegant city that Hiroshima is now. And of course, one of the big things for making space for peace, sorry, I shouldn't show my holiday photos really, is, the United Nations Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So I was there and I spoke while I was there back in August. It was quite a way to come back, my first talk in a very long time. So this treaty has 92 nation states, signatories. It was effective from the 21st of January 2021. And so nuclear weapons are now classified internationally in the same way as chemical and biological weapons and landmines, which is really cool. And in fact, I can see someone in the audience who I met at the event say yes. So finally, I want to talk about future war zones. So in 2019, I wrote that the world had entered a new era of risk and that we're heading towards a second Cold War. Now, clearly, looking at our geopolitics at the moment, looking at the deregulation of things like the New START treaty. This is kind of, it's becoming prescient, isn't it? And there's new forms of nuclear warfare emerging, and new geotechnologies and, forms of cyber warfare as well, which are quite important. And so in the knowledge of all this, I kind of go, oh my goodness, let's try and do something. So that's why I'm here really today, is to encourage you to kind of think through this and think, if you're interested in humanitarian aid, if you're interested in weapons, warfare, that sort of thing, maybe you could do something too. So I published quite a bit that's informed global policy fairly recently. So I did a report that went to the UNA, and then I did a paper that's been quite well cited in global policy, another one to follow fairly soon, hopefully in environmental humanities, which is good. So what's next? So I'm going to continue publishing from my research and provide humanitarian insights into the nuclear climate change nexus. And one of my big issues, having lived on one of the most low-lying islands in the world, is that we don't have an internationally recognized definition of the climate refugee, and that my definition of a nuclear refugee back in 2017 with Tom Davies is inadequate. It's like a line in a paper about something else. So there's this protection gap. And there's this whole issue as environmental degradation is still not kind of really considered to be persecution properly, I think. And so my next kind of work will kind of focus upon bringing these two issues together, and ensuring that communities like the people of Kirisimmas get to kind of stay in place, that they get the dignity of remaining within their home. And I've written on this for quite a while, actually. So this is one of my last articles before before my last talk. So yes, so I hope you found it interesting. It's kind of just a brief snippet into what I write about and what I do, and how I head around the world to find out about nuclear weapons, and some of the insights that I learned. You can see this is my book, and this is some references and stuff I've written. And there's loads of great stuff out there. I would personally not read my references, but read the references and the references, because the authors I cite are way better than I think. Apart from that, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, and I'm looking forward to questions. I mean, so thank you very much.
So while we set up, I'll introduce our second speaker. Thank you so much, Becky, for this great talk. And I think it introduces nicely Frank's presentation now. So Dr. Frank Boulton is a registered NHS medical consultant and an academic. Though being retired, he still teaches medical undergrads at the University of Southampton. You should come to Manchester. In hematology and global health. His concern about nuclear weapons started as a student in the 60s, and it included joining the CND Aldermaston March in 1963, and he co-founded the Edinburgh branch of the medical campaign against nuclear weapons in 1980. He was secretary to the Oxford Research Group think tank between 1994 and up to 2012, and he was a chair of the board of MedAct between 2007 and 2012. A board member of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War between 2017 to 2021. So Frank has written extensively about nuclear warfare from a medical perspective, such as nuclear war and public health, preparedness, protection, and the case for prevention. And he has written on medicine, conflict, and survival journal. So thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's good to be back in Manchester. I used to come here quite often before I retired, and Piccadilly Station is much the same as it was when I last saw it, so I wasn't too lost when I got here. Before I go any further, I would comment that Manchester has seen more than its fair share of tragedies and human suffering. I'm thinking particularly of the awful events which we reminded just of 6 years ago. And this is another event which you got here. Anybody got any idea what this is? I'm sorry about the grainy pictures. Any suggestions? This was actually, I'll tell you what it was in the next slide. It was Manchester in 1996 when there was an IRA bomb. They got warning, so there were no fatalities, but there were quite a lot of injuries and a lot of damage done, £1.4 billion in current value. And that was at the junction of Corporation Street and where the Marks and Spencer building was, and the Semtex with a power of about 2 tons, 2,000 kilograms, which was quite substantial. So I thought that what I would do would be to go back figuratively to that site and see what might have happened had a nuclear bomb been dropped on there. So this is one of the simulations of the effects of a bomb that's about 50 times the size of that Manchester bomb in 1996 on the same site. And I chose that because of the previous experience, just to compare what it was like. Now, those rings, and Alex says it in, by the way, about Alex's book, is wonderful. And all I can say following Alex's talk is carry on writing, please. Because it's what I think I might be toward the end of my writing career. But this is just an example of, it's not a fact, it's just a simulation of the probable effects of a nuclear bomb. This is the smallest nuclear bomb that you could think of. It's still 50 times more powerful than that Manchester bomb in 1996. If we go to one that's 1,000 tons, we've got a bigger ring. And again, these concentric rings, they're not exact marks. They are approximations of the area that would be. And the orange bit in the middle is the bit where you'd be totally annihilated by the blast and flash of the nuclear explosion. So in that case, we've got 5,000, the casualty rate would be estimated, deaths of 5,300. If we go up to the size of a Hiroshima bomb, by the way, I put it in the satellite picture, it's a bit more, some of you will recognize, I think, some of the locations there. This is too big to be useful on the satellite picture, but still gives an area. This is the size of the Hiroshima bomb. The estimated fatalities isn't as high as that actually occurred in Hiroshima, but it's the same order of magnitude, and it shows how dreadful it would be. And again, these are concentric rings of approximate effects. The inner one is, again, the annihilation. The outermost one, the grey one, is the effect of a blast that would destroy all the windows. And the bottom bound down there is the just the 5:30 mark is the Manchester hospitals, the university hospitals, and then towards the top you've got the North Manchester hospitals. So they are just outside the reach, but they would be severely damaged in that sort of situation. And if we go to the next phase up, which is the size of a British bomb, current British bomb, which is 100 kilotons, 100,000 tons worth of explosion, we get an even bigger picture. Yes, that's the size of 100 kilotons, and again you've got this concentric rings, sort of a bit artificial, but still gives an approximation of what's going on, and you can see the order of magnitude of deaths. Now that's just one bomb. This is in a way almost even more ludicrous, because this imagines that there's a gentle southwest breeze blowing all over England at the time the bomb is dropped on Manchester. But it's still valuable to look at because it gives an area of the fallout contamination. So the inner rings, there would be, that's equivalent to 10, the innermost ring, the red bit in Manchester itself, that's the effects of a bomb that would give a fallout of 10 sieverts. We'll come to the definition of what sieverts are in a minute, but that's a lot. And if you're out there for an hour, you die in that red zone. Bit further out is 1 sievert per hour of exposure, and that's pretty bad. A sievert in 3 or 4 hours, you die. Further out from that, it's 100 millisieverts, and then further amounts of the palest of all is 10 millisieverts, which would catch Scarborough and all that sort of thing. So Bradford and Leeds are for it as well. So the point of this isn't an exact prediction, it's a description of the probable scale of effects that would result from a bomb of that sort. And that's obviously devastating. And if you think about what happened at Chernobyl and Fukushima, when the radioactive cloud, Chernobyl, for example, that happened in April 1986. My wife was pregnant with our little boy she was 3 months pregnant. She just learned she was pregnant. And this thing happened. And I was not going to tell her too much because she was all worried. In fact, that little lad is now 36 years old and teaching economics in a school in London. So we haven't done badly. But that's, I mention that simply because, particularly Chernobyl, an awful lot was learnt, and indeed in Fukushima as well, about moving people into safe areas and the extreme difficulty of doing that. So that's the end of that series of slides. Sorry, I think I mixed one. Yeah. So the point about these things called millisieverts, 10 millisieverts, the background that we are exposed to each year over the course of the year is about 3 or 4 millisieverts. So that's your reference point. That's what we're bathed in, a lowish level of radiation, which has kept life going on Earth in all that time. And even if you just get a little blip of a shot of radiation up to 10 millisieverts, on the individuals, virtually no effect. But if you go to populations, there may be just a little bit you see statistically an increased incidence of cancer. There are other things in cancer. There's cardiovascular, there's heart disease, arterial disease, and cataracts and things like that. But I'm really concentrating on cancer as the one about which people seem to be most worried. Low dose. I don't think that it's a low dose up to 100 millisieverts. That doesn't have obvious effect on individuals. You would detect it in population, in there being a greater than expected number of cancers. Moderate dose, well, I don't think it's a moderate dose. I think it's pretty high. These are what's recommended by the International Commission on Radiation Protection. And this is really a body that advises occupational exposures and how much people are allowed to be exposed to before they are regarded as being at extra risk. I wouldn't call 100 to 1,000 millisieverts a moderate dose. I'd say that's quite a big dose. And below that, you've got an even bigger dose, and that is going to kill a lot of people. So you've got the effect on individuals, you've got the effect on populations, and you'll see that there is a sort of difference. The populations is a more statistically measurable thing, but on people, you've got the real clinical effects. So these are the effects of nuclear explosions. And the Chernobyl and indeed Fukushima was accompanied by a management of the population into either staying put indoors for a while or long-term or permanent evacuation to areas. Disaster, a huge impact. And Public Health England, now UK Health and Security Agency, has in 2019 has published what to do in radiological emergencies, but it doesn't really deal with weapons. It deals with things like a radioactive cloud coming over or exposure to a nuclear power plant accident and that sort of thing. So in Britain, we've not really got a policy what to do with nuclear weapons. And that's probably just as well, because it was tried in the 1980s and much derided because it seems such an inadequate response that was being recommended by those government leaflets. But we've got to we may well have to come back to that sort of thing the way things are going at the moment. So we shouldn't really be giving up real careful thoughts about what to do in the case of radiological emergencies, and even if there is a nuclear war or limited nuclear war. The last line there says Zaporizhia. Becky referred to this sort of thing as well. Nuclear power plants being used as targets for a novel form of hybrid nuclear warfare, and that has been demonstrated in Ukraine. Not that the reactors themselves have been damaged yet, but the supporting structures, including the electricity supplies, them have been, and that could be extremely serious. So that's the end of the bit about individual nuclear weapons and their effects. I've got another version of this picture a bit later on, but this shows the time scale of how many nuclear bombs there were in the world from 1945 to the current time. And you can see that there was just above 1960, that's when the Cuba crisis was. The peak is the Reagan years, and followed by the Reagan-Gorbachev agreements. And one would like to think that that decline would have gone to zero by 2022, but of course it hasn't. And we'll come to that in a minute. This is, I think, the most important slide of my talk. I'm going to say some things which are a bit more controversial, and people may well come back about that. But this is literally the killer, and I'm so glad Becky mentioned it as well. This is really, really important because it's much neglected. We're much more concerned about climate change than we are about nuclear winter. Now, what happens in nuclear winter is that the effects of a nuclear war, an exchange of dozens or even hundreds of nuclear weapons, will be targeted on cities. And the thing about the nuclear tests, they weren't done on cities, obviously. They were done on deserts and sea. And so an awful lot was learned about the nuclear, the radiation and the explosive power of those bombs, but nothing on cities except Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And they are still very important historical landmarks about the effects, the destructive effect of nuclear weapons. But that was only 2 cities. If we're talking about 100 cities, then there's a real possibility of major firestorms in those cities, sending up particles into the sky and occluding the sunlight, not for just the next year, but for the next decade. Under those circumstances, people will starve to death. And the next slide just shows a recent picture, a recent paper in 2022 from people who spent a lot of time looking at the science of nuclear winter. And what we've got there is, in the second column, degrees of scale of nuclear war, from 100 weapons at 15 kilotons to 500 at 100 kilotons. Now, one important thing about that bottom row, 500 weapons, 500 weapons exchanged, each at 100 kilotons, that's about 5% of the total arsenal we've got in the world now. So we've got more than enough, far more than enough to do far more damage. And the column on the far right refers to how many would die of starvation after 2 years. And that bottom one, still just a small proportion of the total armaments. 2.5 billion people would die. That's 30% of the world's population would die within 2 years. So that is the real shocker that we need to bear in mind if a nuclear war breaks out. So we're still hoping upon hope that it won't break out, but if it does, this is the sort of scale of damage that one can expect. Now, obviously, we haven't got proof. It's not happened yet, but the climate modelers who have been modeling this very meticulously are highly qualified. And of course, they've got their experience through the work on climate change anyway. And interestingly, the people who are climate change deniers, the same people who are denying the nuclear winter. The same sort of tradition goes on, particularly from the tradition of Teller and his crew who invented the H-bomb. So we've got the same human trend. Now, just a month ago, IPPNW Europe in particular dropped this declaration, and you can look at it on this link. And if you get this afterwards, you can look on this link, but you can also just Google Hamburg Declaration 2023. And this is a statement about war in Europe. It doesn't mention Russia. It just says the effects of nuclear war in Europe on humankind, and indeed the possible widespread destruction of life on Earth, that's the nuclear winter. Therefore, no leader has the moral right to use nuclear weapons under any circumstances. So that's the moralistic stance that we in IPPNW and MEDEC take on this particular thing. And it's all very well, some might say, but that is the backdrop to our thinking. So a little bit history again, rather different version from Becky. I love your picture, but this is a bit different. So you can see the far left, that's when Cuba was. You can see how much the Russians had, or the USSR had, compared with America. And America far outstripped at that time. But Cuba was in their backyard, and the last thing that America wanted was any possibility of their backyard being influenced by the Soviets. The NPT, that's the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has also been mentioned. That was the one in 1970. Pretty well the whole world has signed up to this. And I'll come to a bit of an explanation of what that is in a minute. Then we go along, the foundation of IPPNW in 1980. Then we've got the various events after that. The INF Treaty, that's the Gorbachev effect, the first treaty. And that's when we began the first decline in numbers. Going to the right, we've got the fall of the Berlin Wall, Ukraine getting independent in 1993. In 1990-91, the Budapest Memorandum in 1993, by which Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan returned their nuclear weapons stocks to Russia. in exchange for assurances that they would be safe. Then going on beyond that, NATO didn't have a job after 1990, but it made itself a job, became useful again. I'm saying this cynically, I know, but basically when Serbia became the villain of the piece, NATO found itself another target. And that continued a few years later when also the Serbs were having a fight over Kosovo. Then we got the various changes of regime in Ukraine, ending up with Zelensky as a result of the Russian occupation of Crimea and the eastern regions of Ukraine. Then the last cluster are the more recent events about which most people will be reasonably familiar now. The COVID-19, which had a big impact on the world, and including nuclear weapons. The TPNW, which Becky has so nicely described, it's a really positive move, although if you read Becky's book, which I thoroughly recommend, you will see that she very sensibly puts some, not caveats, but puts some modifications of alternative thinking about the significance of the TPNW. I think it's the best bit of news that we've had in the nuclear world, but don't expect it to save the world yet. It's still got a long way to go. So that's the bit really as far as we go. Just the last bit, missed opportunities. This is a really sad series of events because basically my feeling is that NATO wasn't really needed after the Gorbachev, George Bush Sr. Basically were approaching at that point. And indeed, Yeltsin expressed quite a lot of interest, if not becoming a member of NATO, at least becoming a sort of state within the sort of family. So at that time, there was a real opportunity. Unfortunately, at the same time in Russia, the oligarchs took over. And they're on the whole are pretty bad news, although I have heard encouraging stories about good things that oligarchs have done because they've got money. I won't mention that here, but they can't be entirely blamed for everything that's gone wrong. But they corrupted the City of London. There's no doubt of that as well. Bought Chelsea Football Club. Well, then NATO's eastward expansion, very provocative, particularly when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania joined. And there was also this attempt, the Minsk Accords. I don't know how many people here remember the Minsk Accords, but here they are, just to remind you. A trilateral group, that's the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, Ukraine and Russia, did actually try to sort out something in the years following the occupation of Crimea. But it didn't have American backing, and that American was Obama. So it didn't have that backing, so it didn't take that much further. China has come up with a peace proposal, 12 articles they've got. And I've got them down somewhere, but this is what it amounts to. Now, the China peace proposals are being criticized, I think, understandably, for being too weak and wobbly and really not very meaningful. But I think it's a lot better than nothing. And there are possibilities here that could be worked on. But we've got a huge way to go yet on this. But particularly all parties should support Russia and Ukraine. So you can see that from the Western point of view, this is bad news. We don't want to hear this. We don't want to support Russia in any way. So that's not really our cup of tea at the moment. So this is one important slide which distresses me enormously, because this is the effect of attacks on hospitals in Ukraine. Now, you can see along the east side, that cluster of attacks more or less coincides with the border between the eastern provinces, the Donbass regions, and the rest of Ukraine. And I guess, I'm pretty sure that a lot of those targets, hospitals are targets, not really because they want to bomb hospitals, but because people rather foolishly think that hospitals can keep them safe. So they launch their military attacks from hospital sites, which is a really bad thing to do. But quite a lot of those hospitals would have been bombed by Ukraine as well as Russia. But if you go to the western side around Kiev, those would be pretty well all Russian attacks on hospitals in Ukraine. And that's pretty unforgivable in my book. Whoever does it, that's really a tragedy, and it's an awful abuse of the Red Cross principle. So those are important to bear in mind. So, and there's no doubt that horrible things have been happening in Ukraine. largely at the behest of the Russians, but I think there is still an awful lot to be criticized, historically at least, on the Western side too. So let's go to the next slide, actually, because that describes the treaties very briefly. The New START, that's what people are cross with Russia about now, because they suspended their allegiance to it. That's what New START was about in 2010 between Obama and Medvedev in Russia, limited to 1,550 warheads each, 3,100 altogether, and also missiles so that's enough to destroy the world. But the thing is, they did institute inspections. Something like 18 inspections each year was the aim. It fell apart during COVID and it hasn't been resumed since. So that's the nature of that particular treaty. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which goes back to 1970, this is the one that's still used. But basically, it's three pillars. The 5 nuclear powers undertake to disarm. The non-nuclear powers are allowed to develop nuclear plants if they want to under IAEA inspections, and they undertake not to develop any nuclear weapons. And we've heard about the TPNW already. So just to go back to one slide, ironically, what Russia has been doing with its threats to use a small number of relatively low, but we don't quite know how low, power nuclear weapons, not carried out yet, but these blood-curdling threats they've made, if those threats work without there being a weapon exploded, and Russia sort of wins, whatever you might mean by that, that will be a disaster for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, because the nations like Iran, Saudi, there are people in Japan, Egypt, Turkey, who would love to possess nuclear weapons, feel that their possession of nuclear weapons will be vindicated because they can now bully their neighbors, putting it crudely. So that's what has been done by those Russian threats is a potential disaster. So coming to my last slide, this is me, not official MEDAC policy, and not endorsed by anybody else, as far as I know. But these are the sort of position. Now, there's a lot missing from there. You can quiz me afterwards about what you think should else be there. But basically, Ukraine must be politically neutral, should not be able to join NATO or the EU. Russia must not be expected to pay reparations. That's the sort of thing that would be very likely to be heard. You know, all this destruction got to be paid for somehow. Well, it was a disaster in 1918-19, although that was exacerbated by the Wall Street crash of 1929-30. But yeah, Marshall-style plan and reconciliation commission. So those are the sort of way that's the sort of way that I would like it to go. But it's a real dilemma for us in the peacemaking world, the conflict resolution world. Of course, we've got a rogue. We've got two rogues, but we've got a rogue in Russia that is going to be very difficult to bring to heel. And I don't know how it's going to be done. And yet the other rogue is the arms industry, the military industrial complex. They're making huge amounts out of this. And the next CIPRI yearbook will show a huge increase. So it is a dilemma, a welcome discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Questions if you want to do this.
Just look at my thing, right?
Yeah, we can comment this. Great. Okay. So thank you very much to the speakers. So I guess many of you will have questions, and I think we have probably some online. How many? 5? Okay. So I probably start with the first 2 questions online, then I'll take questions in the room and then go back online, right? Do you want to give us the first 2 questions?
So first is the general question, which is the doomsday they coming from the religious notion? And then we also have, is there a non-political political party that can really stand up to the politician? Another one that's linked to that is, should we focus more on politicians who are willing to use or threatening to use nuclear weapons what are the reasons why the public and fellow politicians allow politicians to think from the wrong side?
Good question.
We might re-ask using the microphone maybe. Do you want to stay on this side if you don't mind?
Yes, I think I forgot to switch on my microphone, so I hope I was heard last time. Switch it on now. I'm a medical doctor. I'm not a diplomat. I'm not a politician. I don't regard myself as particularly expert in the art of diplomacy or in the art of conflict resolution, although I certainly support conflict resolvers. So from my viewpoint, I would be reluctant to participate directly in a peace negotiations, because these are skilled. This is really skilled jobs for those for whom are trained to do it and are experienced in doing it. So I will stand by cheering the progress that might be made in any conflict resolution and listening with great interest. But I don't think personally I'm in the position to say what. So those suggestions I made are some rough guidelines. They're not demands. But Becky will probably have something much more sensible to say.
Oh, I don't know about that. Could you repeat part of the question if that's okay? Thank you.
Yes. So
Perfect.
Should we focus more on politicians who are willing to use or threatening to use nuclear weapons? What are the reasons why the public and fellow politicians allow such politicians to play a dangerous role in world society?
Yes, we should focus more on them. I've written extensively on this, both as an academic and in like The Guardian and The Independent through like public news. And one of the things that we're actually doing at the moment is we do focus from the perspective of the international arena upon these concerning politicians. So for instance, if we look at North Korea, it's sanctions galore because of their nuclear weapon development and testing program that they have in place. And of course, the challenge is how do you balance sanctions with humanitarian aid and prevent causing a humanitarian crisis alongside the issue of ensuring that appropriate repercussions arise for these places that are violating international law often. In the case of North Korea, I think it's particularly interesting because we can look at somewhere that is clearly, it needs loads of humanitarian aid. It's this locked down nation state with an authoritarian dictator, and it sees nuclear weapons development as a way to kind of push forward and demonstrate its strength. And I think it was really interesting actually during the Trump era, because there was almost a continual ongoing dialogue via Twitter, of all things, between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. And in a way, maybe it's a love-hate relationship, but perhaps that was like the closest that US and North Korean international relations have become for a very long time, just because a conversation was actually being had, admittedly in a public domain, and admittedly, it was ridden with hyperbole, right? But thinking kind of more subtly and through the lens of a diplomat, let's say, when we think about like Russia at the moment and Putin, we are in an absolute state because there is this, this dichotomy essentially, whereby we need to rein him in, we need to prevent him from using nuclear weapons, we need to keep him part of arms control treaties that are essential to kind of retain our safe world. Or, I say safe world, I mean, it's relatively our world, retain safety as much as we can. And how we do that is very difficult. So this is one of the reasons why we have not had World War yet, is because if we were to engage in direct conflict, let's say, with Russia, and to reach a point where perhaps nuclear weapons became a viable option, then of course the consequences, as you beautifully said earlier, Frank, would be reprehensible. So it's very delicate and a really good question. And so that is why we have to endure horrible despots, tyranny and these not undemocratic leaders with nuclear weapons at the moment, because the other option is too bad. So yeah, thank you. Okay.
And I think there was a question about doomsday, isn't it?
Yes, so
I think that would be for you.
Is doomsday here coming from the religious notions?
That's a really good question. To be honest, I'd assume that the term originates from religious connotations, but it's been repurposed, it's been adopted by the scientists and by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists specifically to describe kind of the catastrophic nature of nuclear weapons and climate change. I think it's quite a nice term. I mean, that's why my book is Disarming Doomsday. So yes, but it's a good question. I do not come from a Christian perspective myself. I wanted to clarify. So yes.
Great, thank you. Before we go back to online questions, can I hear people? Yes, please. Let's go 1, 2, and 3 at the top. And 5.
Thank you both for your great presentations. My question was on what role do you, as we discussed a lot about the political ways of trying to tackle this problem and through diplomacy and international relations. I want to ask about what kind of role you felt that activism and a more bottom-up process could play in the process for a nuclear disarmament, or at least calming down the Ukraine war.
Shall we? Yeah, let's take the 2 questions and then
Yeah, actually, I was going to ask quite a similar question, but maybe more specifically, because it seems like in the last year, or I guess specifically last year and 12 days, whatever, since the war in Ukraine started, there's kind of been a growing consensus on the left that arming Ukraine is obviously a positive thing, and it's been quite unchallenged. The Greens in Germany, for example, have been at the forefront of Berlin sending arms to Ukraine. And the Biden administration hasn't really been challenged by their own party and stuff. And even the Labour government in Australia are ramping up military presence in the region. So I was wondering if you think that consensus on the left, or in the Western left particularly, is kind of a permanent and long-term thing, or if it will not, if the kind of movements like the CND will pick up pace at some point in the future again, if that makes sense.
So do you want to start first with the role of activism, I guess, the first one, and grassroots activism, and then the second one?
Really important. I have one word for you: ICAN. The International Campaign for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons. This organisation was grassroots, is activist, and is headed up by somebody called Beatrice Finn, or was until very recently. She's brilliant, and has some amazing originators. So somebody called Dimity Hawkins helped create ICAN, and she's brilliant. She's an amazing academic, amazing individual. But the reason why I mention them is not just because they're awesome, but because they organised and orchestrated and pushed for the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. They lobbied, they helped develop it, they collaborated, they worked across lots of different organisations and lots of different governments, lots of different social groups and civil society groups, as well as nation states themselves, to help this treaty come into being. So from my perspective, kind of grassroots activism can become a very powerful tool and a very powerful way to make real, large-scale, permanent change. Now, of course, once you've made the change, the difficulty is actually enforcing, follow through, right, and then actually creating, you've got the legislation, but how do you get the nation state to comply? How do you get someone like China or India or Russia to relinquish their nukes? That is the big question. But yeah, I think it's very powerful and very useful and a great question. Thank you.
Yeah, we need activists desperately. There are always 2 ways of approaching these sort of problems. If you've got activists, we want them to be knowledgeable, and that's exactly what ICAN are. By the way, I helped found ICAN as well. So it was, the ICAN work was extraordinary because it was well informed, very straightforward, very hard hitting, and struck to the heart of the non-nuclear weapons states who are really angry with the nuclear weapons possessing states for still having nuclear weapons 50 years after they promised to give them up, which is what the NPT was for. So the NPT needed a real boost, and it got it from ICAN, even though the nuclear powers who are behind the NPT don't like ICAN because they accuse it of undermining it. Well, as I said, Russia has done more, in a way, because it threats to undermine the NPT than anything from the TPNW. But we do need the activists. We also need the negotiators, we need the thinkers, we need the knowledgeable people who can actually compromise. And that's very difficult for a pure-minded campaigner to do. Very difficult for a pure-minded campaigner to compromise, because we campaign, we know what the right thing to do is. So it's always a tension, even within the peace movement, exactly how to get around this sort of thing. But we need that tension. It keeps it all going. When I said earlier about the sort of medical role, what we medics can do is explain the medical consequences of nuclear war. There's not just radiation, but also the nuclear winter aspects. That's where we can be, and we can inform the ICANN and allies and CND, etc., about those effects. In fact, I've spoken at CND rallies precisely about the medical effects. So the two, it's a many-pronged approach. So, but we do need the activists.
And I think the second question was around a bit more contemporary. I don't know if you have an answer on giving arms to Ukraine, and maybe in that context specifically, if you have an opinion.
Well, I find that very, very, very difficult, because the sort of Quaker pacifist in me says, what we're doing is feeding the military-industrial complex and giving the arms dealers a lot of money to do an awful lot of destructive things. But we are really faced with an almost intractable dilemma in the nature of the personalities on each side. Stubbornness, particularly perhaps on the Russian side, but very much on the Western side as well. Refusal to admit to mistakes. But I think it's even more than that, and I've got to be very careful about how I say this, but we in the West sort of espouse human rights in a way that we think goes back to the Magna Carta, which actually is not true, but actually that's how we trace it back. The tradition within the West of a liberal form of human rights. That's not the tradition within Confucianism, for example. And even though we've had nearly 100 years of communism in China, the traditional Chinese approach is still very much of that of the responsibility of the community as much as it is of individuals. So we do have a sort of different fundamental attitudes. That's not to say that we should be wrong or misguided in criticizing, for example, the Chinese and their human rights records, but it's just that we've got a different sort of frame of reference. And that's the sort of thing that's got to be really addressed in the long term about any peace deal that may come over this particularly horrendous situation. So I don't have an answer about what to do about the rearming and whether Schultz is right or wrong or whatever. But it's a tragedy of the most horrendous proportions. And sooner or later, we've got to somehow get it sorted out so that there is a post-Ukraine war world which can start being constructive again. And by the way, can deal with, approach in a much more constructive way, the big problem of climate change. Because as Becky said, climate change and nuclear war, there's a strong connection between the two of them. Many people now know about climate change, but don't really cotton onto the fact that the situation in Ukraine is really part of the same picture of the dangers of nuclear arms.
Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, go on.
Go on.
Go on. I actually think that it's an unfortunate necessity to and we have to support Ukraine. Their human rights are at stake, their humanity is at stake, their nation state that they've fought incredibly hard for, to gain rights back to is at stake. And I think of them very much in the context of being an indigenous population, an indigenous community that has been colonized for years, right? So it would be reprehensible not to support them in their right to retain their autonomy. And this, of course, is kind of the low point, really, of a decade of provocation from Russia. Whether we're thinking about kind of the annexation of Crimea, activity in Donbass. So it's I agree with you, absolutely. It's a really emotive and really difficult issue. But I think that the right to life and the right to survival is at stake, both the culture, community and, the individual in Ukraine at the moment. And I think that the only choice we have morally and ethically is to support Ukraine. But of course, in an ideal world, Russia would not have invaded, but because they invaded as a response to provocation, therefore it's appropriate action the same.
Yeah.
You're basically calling us to organize an event on Ukraine specifically to push. I feel it's an entire talk in itself. I think we had a question on, there's two, 1, 2, 3. Let's take the 3 and answer as they go.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm actually from Ukraine and here for the short visit in Manchester. And next week I'm coming back. I'm a war reporter in Ukraine. So I was curious about the event when I paid a visit to the city. And I must say I'm pretty surprised with the conclusion of Mr. Boulton about the neutrality of Ukraine. So after you've seen all this proven track record, how the things are escalating and how Russia in numerous times actually violated agreements, including the Budapest Agreement. Don't you think that this unresolved war, like by neutrality, is just a matter of time of the further escalation from Russia, which will give them the time to rearm and to push back again?
Thanks for that. My question really is about the health effects on Indigenous communities really that have been tested on. And there is a lot of consensus about Indigenous communities and people who live in maybe the Marshall Islands that they have received a very negative health consequences because of it. But there are so many Indigenous communities that have to try and prove that they have been negatively affected health-wise, especially in Australia and places like that, because they didn't have health records at the time, so there was no way of really knowing. And there's been many moves to sort of help the veterans that worked in Australia and places like that to for them to receive compensation, and they were able to prove in the Supreme Court that they did have negative health consequences, but the Indigenous people lost their case. And I just want to know, is there any way of helping them to prove that there are negative health consequences, even though it happened in the 50s? There are still generational effects that are still going on today, and sometimes it kind of is forgotten about, it's seen as a thing of the past, and people forget that there's still people, being negatively affected. And there's a lot of testimonies from Indigenous people saying, this happened to me at the time of the bomb. Like, obviously, about the black mist stuff. This happened to me when the bombs were dropped. I lost my vision. I became seriously ill. And there seems like a lot of consensus in academia that they didn't receive high enough doses of radiation poisoning, or this couldn't have happened, but neglecting their way of life, the way that they eat off of the land, the way they maybe didn't wear shoes at the time, things like that. Is there a way of helping them to prove that they have been affected? Because I think sometimes it is good to say it's bad that it happened just because their culture and communities were stripped away from them. But can we help prove that they're negatively affected health-wise? I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you. And let's take the third one, so then we have a round and then go online.
Thank you for your talk. Frank, you mentioned that in the 80s there was a plan to, I think it was in the 80s, to basically protect people against nuclear war. What's the plan now? And if there is no plan, does that mean there's no point to trying to save lives, basically?
So a plan, just repeat that, a plan for?
Yeah, so in the 80s, there were shelters, I assume, in case of a nuclear winter. I assume they're gone now. And if they're gone now, what's the plan in case of a nuclear attack? Like, do we run, or do we go, where do we go? That sort of thing. And if there's no plan, then does that mean there's no point in trying to save lives, essentially?
Okay. I guess there's two angles. I think there's one that is specifically for you.
I was going to say,
and
I
then
actually have
medical.
something to add to that, because before I became an academic, I worked professionally as an emergency planner and manager. So with the Civil Contingencies Act, so I maybe have a bit of insight into what is and isn't done. So between us, I think we'll.
No, I think the medical aspects will be for both of you, also because of your work on indigenous communities. I think it links very well. And then one specifically for the war in Ukraine, I think.
Okay.
On the Ukraine, my heart goes out to you and your country folk, because there's no doubt that particularly for the western side of Ukraine, this has been the worst thing possible that could happen to a nation. And ironically, the United Nations was set up with the idea that nations are entitled to their borders, and they have been infringed big time in this particular event. So I have enormous sympathy with the suffering that has been. Also the cannon fodder that the troops, particularly on the Russian side, I mean, in the First World War, the criticism from the people at large was these were lions led by donkeys. So the soldiers were the lions and the donkeys were the generals. And that was occurring in the First World War. We seem to have that same irresponsible attitude to the value of human life, taken particularly on the Russian side. So there's no doubt there's been really awful things happening. And yeah, I mean, my heart goes with Becky. I haven't expressed it quite as much because I find it very difficult to support any form of war, because war gets us nowhere. And there's never been a war that's not been followed by another war. So it just gets on worse and worse. So that would be my feeling for you. We'll deal with as far as what can be done. Now, some years back, the British War veterans, included the victims of the testings, tried to sue the government for reparations. A whole series that have been done. On one occasion, they submitted their case too late. It was a technical problem in the way that things got presented. And I was asked if MEDAC would support that. Now, at that time, MEDAC had no money. So I said no. And I was severely criticized for not supporting them, which is hard cheese for someone in my position who wanted to do. But the other thing about the British government in particular, and I've come across this in my current professional life away from the MEDAC work, is that the British government has traditionally been extraordinarily mean about compensating anybody for anything. Whereas in New Zealand, they have a much more liberal no-fault compensation scheme. So I don't think that we can prove the association. There's all sorts of technical difficulties and analytical difficulties in proving a lot of these mishaps, but that doesn't mean we should not compensate for them. So that would be my approach.
So I've written on this and worked across communities, specifically with Article 6 and 7 to help communities get recognition for the harms that they've experienced. And there's many different ways to do this. And I work with the British nuclear test veterans as well. So I prepared several reports, including one that's quite well known called Nuclear Families, that highlights the medical and health issues that British nuclear test veterans have had. I published this in 2019. They gained their medal and their recognition this year. I've been lobbying, and that's all I have to say as far as the British nuclear test veterans are concerned. But I went through and I considered health through the biopsychosocial model. So I didn't just look at physical well-being. And I looked at inherited trauma, I looked at disability, I looked at anxiety, I looked at all these things that kind of come together to show and reflect the true burden that nuclear weapons testing has had to the nuclear test veteran community in this report. So, for instance, statistics for self-reported, but statistics for disability, look at scales to look at kind of day-to-day life well-being, testimonials, interviews with 144 family members, and that sort of thing, right? So you have this kind of vast report at the end of it that details every aspect of this community's life and shows something is horribly wrong. So that is kind of the basis of my argument. And I did the same in Charismas. So I went out, I interviewed the women, I lived with them, I looked at their lives, I spoke to their grandmothers, I spoke to their children, I spoke to their husbands, right? I gained insights into their lived experience, into what they were frightened of, what they worried about for the future, into their lifespan, right? I spent time in the cemeteries. I spent time in the, looking at cause of death, for example, for Fijian nuclear test veterans, and looking at death certificates. Oh my God, if you're interested in death certificates, I am your woman. I've looked at so many of them in the last decade, you would not believe. I've been able to kind of extrapolate from things like death certificates, from early death, from descriptions of, lived experience is what we call it, from ethnographic work, where you're actually kind of detailing and exploring what it is actually like on a day-to-day basis for these traumatized communities. And I found that has been very helpful and very useful for gaining recognition and gaining compensation for these affected communities. I've also worked with the Rocky Flats downwinders in America who were affected by nuclear weapons, by what was called a plutonium pit processing plant, to help them share their experiences and produce a report that describes their health experiences, because health isn't just physical. It's not just, as you said earlier very accurately, about how much cancer someone has. It's about well-being, it's about life chances, it's about opportunities. There's more ways to be disabled than I've had hot dinners this in my lifetime, right? And so that's how I approached this issue, and that's how I produced reports for both the British nuclear test veterans. You worked on the Rocky Flats downwinders with brilliant Steph Malin and Kirsten Iverson, I should add, and produced my report and my paper on gaining reparations on humanitarian issues and challenges for the Charismas community, and again with brilliant scholars. So thank you.
I guess there's loads of room for activism and writing reports and supporting families in this topic. I think the last question we had here was about plan to save lives. Like, do we actually need one in case of a nuclear war, right? Like, what should we do? Get a bunker.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm really fascinated by this. I've written papers on nuclear bunkers. I've explored nuclear bunkers. I worked in a nuclear bunker, repurposed, Dorset County Council Emergency Planning Service, where I was an emergency planner for 5 years before becoming an academic. And one of the things that fascinated me is in an old cupboard, in a dustier, less ventilated part of the facility, was this gigantic box filled with documents called things like Protect and Survive. Yes. And you open them up and you look, and it tells you to paint your windows white and to hide under the stairs in case of nuclear attack. So that was my first encounter with what was called civil defence at the time. It was anything but civil. It didn't defend anybody. It was about the survival of state over society, right? It was about the survival and the protection of those who were safe, and those who were high up, like politicians, the royal family, that sort of thing, not us. And the UK was almost exclusive in taking this approach. So if you read my book, I've got a chapter on this, and I've written papers, if you prefer an academic paper, that sort of thing. But like in America, we had community shelters in Sweden, in Russia, in France. There's still signs for community shelters in New York, in fact. So the UK was almost exclusively unique in not caring about whether its population survived or not. Now, snap forward to the present day, Civil Contingencies Act means that we do multi-emergency planning, multi-agency, so police, fire, ambulance, MOD, voluntary organisations, that sort of thing. And we use what's called the emergency planning cycle. So, preparedness, response, recovery, and kind of long-term, recovery and that sort of thing. And we do still plan for nuclear attack. We just don't do it in public. I've never planned for nuclear attack personally. I never will plan for nuclear attack, but it happens, AWE, the MOD, they've got to have plans. But because they probably don't include us, we probably don't get to know about them, but I'm sure they are out there. And Public Health England do a grand job. I actually did quite a lot of my work with, well, now the Health Security Agency, but with PHE when I was doing my PhD. So Professor Stephanie Hayward was one of my mentors, and who was the head of radiation protection at the time, and a wonderful lady. So it's really, really difficult. As you said, it's really hard to know what will happen, right? We don't know. We don't get to know. We can speculate, which is why talks like yours are really helpful, Frank, for giving us these insights. You know, we need more people like you getting out there. So thank you. Great question.
I'm probably the only person in this room who's ever been down at Anderson shelter during wartime, because in 1944-45, the Germans flung over things that were not that less primitive than what the Russians have been, some of the Russians, the rockets that have been sent over, guided rockets, guided by the Finns and the system that the Germans were put in them. And I remember going down to Anderson shelter in January 1945 because of the buzz bomb attack. That was at the bottom of our garden, a sort of semi-submerged with corrugated roof. So I sort of feel an affinity very weakly with the terrible things being going on in Ukraine. Yeah, I mean, basically, the bomb shelters were not for the public. They were for the government officials to continue afterwards. But even then, the hope was that they could emerge after some months into a relatively a world in which they could survive. And so what's more ludicrous than that? I mean, the world has been obliterated. There can be a nuclear winter for the next decade. And there they are coming out hoping to. So there is a sense of ludicrosity about the whole thing. And I think probably as far as the general public is concerned, once Protect and Survive have been derided so successfully, it was just pointless in trying to persuade the government that there was going to be, to persuade the general public that there was an effective answer to a nuclear attack. But yes, we must keep our governments going, even if the people aren't there to be governed.
You'll have 2 minutes to answer 2 questions. So I'll probably ask you to pick one and deal. And just before I forget, because I will, there is drinks just after, so you can carry on this conversation after. So let's get the 2 questions online and pick up one.
So the first question is, can we agree on another missed opportunity when Gorbachev proposed to create a common new world order? And the second question is, I would agree that Russia should not pay reparations if Mr. Putin can be judged in an international criminal court. What do you think?
I'm worried about the second. What's the first one?
Can we agree on another missed opportunity when Gorbachev proposed to create a common new world order?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, well, yes, there was real hope. 1990 was the golden year. Apartheid in South Africa had gone. Nelson Mandela was released. So great hope. Berlin Wall falls. Great hope. German reunification. Well, some didn't like the thought of that because there were thoughts that Germany had become too powerful. But nevertheless, real hope in the early 90s. And the big disappointment was that that was never followed up in a constructive way. And it was Clinton in 1996, the second Clinton administration, that really put the mockers on there being an effective partnership of some sort with the post-Soviet Russia political establishment. So that was a big opportunity that was missed. And it's a bit like after 9/11. For a few days, the world held its breath to see what George W. Bush would do. And he did the worst thing. He let loose the war on Afghanistan and Iraq at that particular point. So there were lots of opportunities to do things better. I think the encouraging thing is it's recognized by many that it was a missed opportunity. And there is a possibility that if that opportunity were to rise again, it would be heard more sympathetically. But in 1990, there were only about 4.5 billion people in the world, 5 billion. In 2020, there's something like 8 billion. So there's an awful lot more people around, and and problems have got worse. But yes, I think that was a big missed opportunity.
I actually don't think it was a possibility, because the thing is that everybody loved Gorbachev apart from his own people.
Yeah.
He had a terrible problem with his own nation state reputation. And so therefore I don't think it could have actually happened because of the backlash that he might have experienced.
Yeah.
But it's a pity, it should have happened. I wish he'd just the world would be a different place.
Yeah.
Great answer. What was the other question?
The other is on the not paying reparation for the Ukraine, Russia not paying reparation for Ukraine.
I'm trying. I think Putin needs to be tried as a war criminal. I can't wait till he is. I hope he doesn't die before it happens. Probably. And I think that personally, my perspective is that reparation should probably come from Russia too. But that's just something we'll have to disagree on. So
I'm very prepared to listen to that. I mean, it's a very understandable wish that the perpetrators should pay, just as expected the West, who perpetrated the release of so much carbon dioxide in the industrial age, and the West also reparations for slavery, that sort of thing. Yeah, I can understand and sympathize with that. But I think there will be an awful lot of Russians who, when they learn what's happened, will be utterly horrified by what's been done in their name. And I don't think they should be made to feel guilty. That's a little bit from me. I haven't got an easy answer on that one, but I think that somehow it's a world responsibility, not necessarily that of one set of people. Should Putin be tried as a war criminal? Well, yes. There's plenty of evidence that he's done a huge amount of damage, but Russia is a veto-carrying member of the Security Council, and that's a really, really difficult problem to deal with. There's all sorts of things wrong with the Security Council, not least that Britain is a member of the veto-carrying member, Britain. But nevertheless, that situation, Russia holds a lot of cards. And it's going to be very difficult to get past that. So the answer could be, in the post-war world, when the Russian people, enough of them come to terms, or don't come to terms, with the awful things that are being done in their name. It's a faint hope, perhaps.
Thank you very much. I encourage you to continue these chats now. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. I invite you to follow us just here. So thank you very much, and thank you to the speakers.